Thanks, Sarah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
All righty. We're going to be looking at an address that Robert Reish gave to Commonwealth Club of California back in 2017 about a book he had just written called The Common Good. And I just really get it. I've watched this a few times. I just really get a kick out of his at ease with audiences and the amount of material he presents. So after that, we will try to find out what people think and hopefully have a good discussion. Go ahead, Sarah.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm Clara Jeffrey, Editor-in-Chief of Mother Jones, and your moderator for tonight's program. You can find the Commonwealth Club online at commonwealthclub.org on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. It's now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, former U.S. Secretary of Labor and author of the new book, The Common Good, Robert Reish. Secretary Reish has served in 3 administrations plus transition for the Obama administration, including, of course, heading the Department of Labor under President Bill Clinton. Time magazine named him one of the 10 most successful cabinet secretaries of the century. He's now a Chancellor's Professor in Public Policy at the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Reish is also a founding editor of the American Prospect magazine, and his commentaries can be heard weekly on Public Radio's Marketplace. Professor Reish has also written 13 books, including The Work of Nations, Supercapitalism, Aftershock, and Beyond Outrage. His documentary and media company makes YouTube videos that are quite popular, and 2 full-length documentaries, Inequality for All and Saving Capitalism. In his new book, The Common Good, he said that America is trapped in a downward cycle of whatever it takes politics that has left us more divided than ever. As a result, Americans are experiencing an erosion of trust in the media and other institutions, yawning income inequality, and the resurgence of overt racist movements. That's a lot, but don't despair, however, because he argues that this cycle can be reversed. To tell us how, please welcome Robert Reish.
Thank you, Clara. Well, thank you, and thank you, Clara. And it's so nice to see you. As you can see, Donald Trump has worn me down. When I was last here at the Commonwealth Club, George, I was 5'10", wasn't I? Just about. More seriously, sometimes it is human nature to take a lot of things for granted, and then when we are in danger of losing them, discover how much value they actually are to us. And I think that, to some extent, that is what is happening in the country right now around the issue of democracy and our system of government, much of which we take for granted. I have spent much of the last 50 years in and out of government. My first job was as an intern in the summer of 1967 for then Senator Robert F. Kennedy. And it was very exciting. It was not, my job was not terribly glamorous. I was put in charge of Robert F. Kennedy's signature machine. In those days, there was a pen at the end of a kind of a long wooden kind of machine that you had to turn it on. My job was actually to line up all of the letters that had been written by his secretaries, he called them, we called them those days, and to all the constituents, and make sure that the Robert F. Kennedy pen was exactly in the right place. And I did that for about 3 months or so. I was getting very bored. And I decided one night I would kind of sneak into Senator Robert F. Kennedy's office, and I wrote on his stationery, on the typewriters there, for, letters to my friends. And I wrote, Dear Mr. Dworkin, congratulations on having the largest nose in New York State. Robert F. Kennedy. And it was going to... And they still have these, and they have it on their walls. And but one day, the reason I bring this up is that one day I was waiting in the corridor in the Senate office building, and the elevator opened, and there was coming out Senator Robert F. Kennedy and his aides, and I had seen almost nothing of the senator that whole 3-month period. I was just signing his name, or making sure that the pen signed his name. And I was in awe, as you can imagine. And he looked at me as he was coming out. He was rushing around. He moved extremely fast. And he looked at me and he said, "How's the summer going for you, Bob?" Bob, he called me. He knew my name. I almost couldn't believe my ears. And I was so struck that I couldn't speak. I just went, ha, ha, ha. And I think that had he asked me to run his signature machine for another 3 months, I would have said yes, because of respect. I think that's the word I'm searching for. Because just that little gesture of knowing my name, knowing who was working for him in that little office with the signature machine, although he was surrounded by high-powered aides, that little slight show of respect charged me up and made me feel wonderful about what I was doing. You see, not that many years before, I had heard his brother, when John F. Kennedy was president of the United States at his inauguration, imploring us not to ask what America can do for us, but what we can do for America. And in my own very, very small way, I thought years later, running that signature machine, particularly when he recognized me, Bob, that I was doing a little something for America. American democracy is very fragile. And I think that the respect, going back to that word, that is so essential to it, respect for others, respecting people who work for us, respecting people who are of different views, different parties, is so essential. The rule of law, equal political rights, all now are surprisingly fragile. Years later, I went to Yale Law School. I had met two people already before I even went to law school that I went to law school with, and they were there in class. One was named Bill Clinton, and the other was named Hillary Rodham at that time. Another person in that same class with us was named Clarence Thomas. And when the professor would ask a question, the first person with her hand in the air was Hillary Rodham, and she when she was called upon, she got the question right almost every time. I was about the third or fourth, and I half the time got it wrong. Clarence Thomas never answered any question. And Bill Clinton never came to class. It's amazing how things continue on in various guises and forms. But I had been inspired by that time, not just by John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, but also by somebody else who had been one of my protectors. I had always been very short, and I had looked to older boys to kind of protect me from the bullies. And when I was in college, I learned that one of my protectors, who was, again, 6 or 7 years older than I was when I was a kid, really needing that kind of protection, his name was Mickey Schwerner. And Mickey Schwerner, some of you may know Michael Schwerner. In the summer of '64, he was, along with 2 other civil rights workers, he had been tortured and murdered in Mississippi. And when I heard that my protector, somebody who had kept me from the bullies, had been tortured and murdered by the real bullies of America, I decided that I couldn't do anything else but try to respond to bullying in every form there was. And so I was at Yale Law School because I, like Bill Clinton and Hillary Rodham, and I assume Clarence Thomas and Richard Blumenthal was in that class, a lot of us, we were there not to practice law. We were there because we wanted to make the country better. We wanted to make it stronger. We wanted to help the underdogs. We wanted to reduce the bullying. And I wish I could say that the country is much better. I didn't expect, honestly, what we are now witnessing. And I say this with full respect, going back to that word, for those of you who are Republicans. I respect you. I don't like you, but I respect you. No, that's not true. I like you and respect you. One of the real problems today, I got a wind of the change, actually, when I was Secretary of Labor for Bill Clinton. After Newt Gingrich came to his ascendancy as Speaker of the House, it was almost as if the climate had suddenly changed, as if a different atmosphere, a different atmospheric pressure came to Washington. I remember because I had been testifying in November before the change, before the big change, Newt Gingrich coming in as Speaker. Had been testifying before the authorizing committee that was looking over the Labor Department. It had responsibility for what I was doing as Secretary of Labor, and I would answer their questions, these members of Congress, and they would ask me more questions, and some of them, Democrats as well as Republicans, would try to trip me up, and that was fine, and that was part of what we all did, and I was pretty well prepared. I tried to be as well prepared as I could. But then in February, after Newt Gingrich came in and brought in a lot of others with him, I was testifying before the same committee. But there was a big difference. It was not the kind of almost good-natured ribbing. I remember I was answering the question of one of the new members of Congress. I had never seen him before. His name was Duke Cunningham. I think it was Randy Cunningham. Some of you may remember this man. Do you remember him? San Diego? He went to prison, didn't he? Well, this is before he went to prison. And he was asking, I was trying to deliver testimony, and he interrupted me, and he said, Mr. Secretary, I've read everything you've ever written, all your books, all your articles. And I thought for a quick instant that maybe he was going to say something nice. But he said, I've also read Karl Marx, and can you tell me what the difference is between you and Karl Marx? And he said it without a smile. And I didn't know whether he was joking, and I turned to my assistant and said, should I make a joke? And she said, no. And I said, Congressman, there is a difference. and I'd be happy to talk with you about it when we have a chance. But that was just the beginning. I remember coming back to my office as Secretary of Labor and finding people I didn't know, people who were staffers, young people from the Republican side of the House who were going through my files. And I said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We have permission to go through your files." And I said, "What are you looking for?" And they didn't answer me. And I went to my chief of staff and I said, "What are they looking for?" And my chief of staff, she said, "They're looking for anything they can find to get you." Do you see how quickly it changed? It was Newt Gingrich, and it was that year, 1995. Donald Trump is the culmination of something. He's not the cause. He's the culmination of years, and it's not just Republicans. Let me make sure you understand this. There has been a change in Washington. There's been a change in American politics. There's been a change in the ethics by which many of us have run and directed our lives. I saw it in business and in the business community as well. We used to have something called shareholder and stakeholder capitalism. The difference was that stakeholder capitalism, the older form of capitalism, was a form in which corporations had some responsibilities to all their stakeholders, not just their shareholders, but also their employees, also their communities. This building we're now in was the headquarters of Harry Bridges, the labor union leader. It wasn't always easy. There were some terrible things that happened around this building. 2 labor employees, 2 labor leaders, 2 of his helpers were killed right on the street in front of this building. So I don't want to make the past seem more romantic than it was. But after the Second World War, there was more labor peace, and there was an assumption that corporations did have responsibilities to all of the stakeholders in the economy. And that changed in the 1980s. It changed not because anybody was a bad person, and I want to emphasize this with you too. I'm talking about the system, systemically. Things changed systemically. It changed in part because with the advent of unfriendly takeovers, it became almost impossible for publicly held companies and their CEOs to do anything except maximize shareholder returns. And what we saw both in the public sector and also in the private sector, in government and in business, was the gradual seeping new ethic and ethos of whatever it takes, whatever it takes, whatever it takes to make money as much as possible, whatever it takes to gain political power as much as possible, without attending to the underlying institutions, the underlying social reality that was being ripped up in the process. By the time I was Secretary of Labor, I spent a lot of time in the Rust Belt, in the South, in parts of America that my cabinet colleagues, one of the things is, if you're Secretary of State or even Secretary of the Treasury or you're Secretary of the Interior, even the Interior, when you go to conferences, you go to the capitals of the world, you go to Paris and London and Beijing, and you go to wonderful, wonderful places. Now, I'm not in any way demeaning Toledo. But I went to Toledo, and I went to Kansas City, and I went to every place where there were blue-collar workers in America, and I met with them. And I made relationships and friends, and I stayed in contact with them. And what I began to pick up, even in the 1990s, from a lot of these red states, or states that were going to become red states, was anger. Anger that people were working harder and harder and they weren't getting anywhere. Labor unions were shrinking for a number of reasons, partly because in order to maximize shareholder returns, you had to outsource or you had to go to states that didn't have labor unions. A lot of people were working harder and getting nowhere. And they told me that in the 1990s. And I went back to Washington, to those congressional committees, and to Bill Clinton and others, and I told them what I was hearing. And I said, and I remember saying, and this isn't kind of I told you so, but I remember saying, you know, if we don't do anything to improve the plight of people who are working harder and getting nowhere, the median wage was flat. The economy was growing. If we don't do anything, there is going to be a problem here. I can't tell you what kind of problem, but it's not going to be pretty. And we didn't do enough. I wish we had done more. And the George W. Bush administration didn't do enough. And even the Obama administration didn't do enough. And we had almost a meltdown of the entire economy when Wall Street had been doing so much betting the entire national economy in order to make as much money as possible. Well, what happened? What happened was we bailed out Wall Street. We said we were going to bail out homeowners who were underwater, but they didn't get very much at all, and not a single Wall Street executive went to jail. And do you know how that played in the Rust Belt? In the South, in the Midwest, in the red states, as well as blue states, because I went out there, and people were angrier than ever. And I heard people say, the game is rigged. It's rigged. It's rigged against us. And in 2015, 2 years before the election, at the start of 2015, when I went out to see people and talk to people that I knew in all of these cities and all of these states, blue-collar workers, labor union leaders, people who were already angry, you know what they told me? They said, when I asked them, who are they considering for president? They said, well, we're considering either Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. And I said, how can you put those two people in the same sentence? And they said back to me, either one is going to shake up America. They're going to shake up Washington. We can't go on as we're now going. And here we are. And Donald Trump, again, is a consequence, not the source, a consequence of a fundamental breakdown. Not a breakdown that's any individual's fault. It's a breakdown because we didn't pay enough attention. And so I say to a lot of people who say, well, I'm going to fight hard in the midterms in 2018 and then in 2020 to make sure that Donald Trump is no longer there, the Republicans are out. I say, focus also. I don't care what you want to do politically, but focus on the bigger issue. What's going on in the country that caused all this? Focus on that anger, that desperation, that anxiety. Focus on the fear. We need to get on with what must be done. Now, let me summarize, and I'm going to have, hopefully, a lot of time for your questions, and Clara's going to help me. But let me summarize by saying that I am optimistic. Now, that may surprise you, but I am optimistic. I'm optimistic for a number of reasons. I'm optimistic, number one, for the very reason I started out with. It is when we are losing something that people recognize its value. I have never heard in recent years so many people tell me how valuable our democracy is, how much they're going to fight for it, how concerned they are about it, and how they understand that as citizens, their responsibility is not just to vote or be on juries and to pay their taxes. Their responsibility is to be involved. I have not heard that much from people about engagement and involvement since the anti-Vietnam War years of the late 60s. I'm also encouraged because I look at my students. And I have never seen, I've been teaching since the beginning of the 1980s. I have not come across a generation of students, of young people that are as committed, as engaged, as dedicated, as idealistic, as determined to change the direction of this country for the better as this generation of young people. Including high school people, those kids in Florida. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? And I'm also encouraged because so many people are so determined to save our democracy. These are trying times for many of us. I don't know how your blood pressure is. I try to distract myself every day. I go on little vacations. I try not to get burnt out. But I just want to tell you that your engagement and involvement is critically, critically important. So thank you all. And now, Clara?
All right. Well, once again, I'd like to thank Robert Reish, former U.S. Secretary of Labor and author of the new book, The Common Good. I'm going to ask a few questions of my own, as well as mix in some questions I've been given by all of you. You make a very stirring call for us to listen to the better angels of our nature. But if one thing has become clear in the Trump era, it's that we've relied on customs to serve as guardrails around politicians and others, and not rules and laws as much as we probably thought. And I'm wondering if there's a rule or a law or two you think that we should really be fighting for in the relative near term, something that's accomplishable.
Well, the only set of rules and laws that I think are absolutely essential are rules and laws that get big money out of politics. And Clara, I say that because I think this is one of the roots of the problem. It's not the only problem. But the difference that I have seen over the last 50 years, one of the biggest differences is the amount of money in politics, a lot of it big money, a lot of it coming from very wealthy people, big corporations, and Wall Street, and it distorts the process, and it makes people even angrier, and it gives them a bigger, a kind of a stronger sense that the game is rigged against them, and unfortunately it is.
I mean, it was pretty amazing to hear Mick Mulvaney admit, the head of OMB and now the Consumer Protection and Finance Bureau, that he basically admitted what I guess we've kind of always known, that he gives his time and effort to the big donors and pretty much not anyone else.
Well, and Donald Trump during the campaign said, when he was asked, do you give big money and why? And he said, yes, I give money because they will call me, they'll return my calls, and they'll do what I want. I mean, both Mulvaney and Trump and others are saying things that everybody knows, and in a way, it's shameful, but in a way, it's admirable that they're at least telling the truth.
Well, speaking of shame, you call for basically resurrecting the idea of shame in American politics and in the public sphere, which is, not a historic rallying cry for liberals. Can you tell us what you mean?
Yes, I think that it is important for us, and that's in a chapter where I talk about shame, but also honor. It's important for us to honor acts that are really honorable in terms of the common good, in terms of promoting the processes and institutions that are really give concrete vent and expression to our ideals, and also shame people and institutions that don't. I mean, the fact of the matter, the mere fact that not a single Wall Street executive went to jail. The fact that Congress continues to haul various people before Congress for perp walks, but then doesn't do anything about what they have done. You've got people like Martin Shkreli, who, ultimately goes to jail, but Congress called him in front of Congress when he raised the price of that very rare drug, 5,000%. And then members of Congress did not do anything legislatively to make it impossible, once again, for members, for CEOs to do something like this. There are no controls on drugs. This, to me, is the essence of shameful behavior. We've got to attach consequences to bad behavior. On the honor side of the continuum, let me just say that I think it's great that wealthy individuals may give a college or a university or a museum a lot of money and their names are up. But why don't we also honor the whistleblowers and honor the social workers and honor the teachers and the people who are the first responders? Why don't we have a way of, even universities should be providing honorary degrees to some of the unsung heroes of this country, so that we have, young people have examples of what citizenship actually means.
And I wonder what you would tell parents and others what to do for modeling to their kids when they have a president who seems to be immune to shame and has no real honor of, as we typically describe it. How do we explain that?
Well, I think what kids respond. I mean, I remember as a kid, I was sitting there. We were one of the first families on our block to actually get a television. It was only the tube was about this big. And my father got it because he wanted to watch the Army McCarthy hearings. And we sat there, and I was a very small boy, and all I remember is watching Joe McCarthy, and I don't know how many, I'm just looking at some of your, just trying to determine how many of you might remember the Army McCarthy hearings. Some of you might. And Joe McCarthy really did go on a communist witch hunt. And my father thought it was not only shameful, but every time McCarthy was on television, my father would start swearing. And I never heard my father swear. Well, that instilled in me a kind of sense that there is right, there is wrong in the public sphere. It was a kind of crude way of doing it, but if you have children or grandchildren and you don't like what you see in the public sphere, you might gently swear.
That makes me feel a lot better about my ranting while I watch at CNN. How does hyperpartisanship and polarization in American politics affect our society and maybe most importantly, our ability to make good policy decisions?
Well, it's awful. It makes it almost impossible. One of my dearest friends from my years in Washington was, and still is, a Republican. He was then a senior Republican senator. And that hyperpartisanship just started, as I said, with Newt Gingrich, and his name is Alan Simpson. And Alan and I, it got so partisan there. I mean, we're talking about the late 1990s, that Alan and I had to sneak out to have lunch together because his staff told him, don't be seen with that labor secretary, and my staff told me, don't be seen with Alan Simpson. And so it was like going, like having a little affair. We had to just, but these days it's much, much worse. These days you don't even have the staff or even the summer interns talking to each other across the aisle. I tell my students, and this is something that I think we should tell each other, and I try to remind myself all the time, the best way of learning is to talk to people who disagree with you, because it forces us to sharpen our arguments, to rethink where we are, to make sure that our assumptions are right. Given how easy it is to surround ourselves just with people who agree with us, to go on the internet and have just the algorithm respond in a way that only we see things that confirm our biases, how easy is it for us to pretend or forget that there are other points of view and that possibly they are correct?
If
Sarah, thank you very much. That was perfect. Let me make a couple of comments before we open it up. Number one, you heard him talk about his protector, Michael Schwerner, who died in the Mississippi riots in 1964. That Michael Schwerner was one of three workers who was killed because of his activities, but that was not our minister, James Reeb, who was killed. He was in a group of three in 65, and he was killed in 65. So just wanted to make sure you understood that Michael Schwerner was not James Reeb. Then the other thing, in the end of the book, Reish has some questions that are meant to facilitate discussion of some of the text when it's done for a book study. They're a little difficult for just this kind of a presentation. So I want to open it up right now for any comments, thoughts you might have about some of the things that were presented. Okay, Dave.
One of the things that struck me is that this is a very timely presentation, and despite the fact that it's 3 or 4 years in the past. But one of the thoughts that kept coming to my mind is that things seem to me to be so much worse now than they were when the secretary, labor secretary, was speaking in 2017. And I just was wondering, what would he say today? What would he advise today? How much more in danger are we of losing our democracy now than we were then? And he described it as being a time of peril, back then. And that was just the thought that I kept having. And I am very, very, very worried about what's happening. And I think that what is happening now has all of the markings of a concerted, organized effort to undermine American democracy and to replace what we've had for over 200 years with, has never been perfect, but with a genuine effort to create a right-wing autocracy,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
a radical right-wing autocracy.
Jan?
Well, Paul had his hand up first.
Paul was first. Okay, sure.
Okay. Yeah, I was in Washington, and when Newt Gingrich did his thing, and it really was the start of total, in-your-face politics. I mean, I saw it firsthand. And before that, Republicans and Democrats would talk to each other, and I was talked to both staff people on both sides. They always came to the administration for asking questions on what we were doing or not doing and all that sort of thing. And so I went into Washington in '78, and by the time Newt Gingrich took over the House and became Speaker, a lot of things changed. So I agree with what Dave just said. I think that it's gotten worse, but I was there in the start of it. In fact, I worked in the Department of Agriculture. I was assigned to the Assistant Secretary's Office for Science and Education. And I wrote speeches for Republicans for about 5 years. I mean, I had trouble with it sometimes, but not too bad. And it wasn't unreasonable. But you couldn't even think of doing that today. I mean, crossing. And I became good friends with the Assistant Secretary. We went golfing together and all kinds of things. And, but that kind of thing would never happen today. You know, it's just so sad.
Indeed. Jan?
Yeah. It was interesting to me that he felt that most people do want to protect democracy, and that we only see the danger coming from the right wing. I am not thrilled with democracy. It is 200 years of white supremacy. And I think that I actually prefer a parliamentary type of government, because right now we are in deadlock because we have two parties. And if we had more parties and had more discussion among the parties where they had to meet and work together in order to form a government, I think we would be a lot better off. You know, I'm not against democracy the way the right wing is. I'm against democracy the way the left wing is. And it won't surprise you to know that I'm pretty far on the left wing. And so democracy, it's not democracy that needs to be protected. It's the people and the rights of the people. And how we get there, I don't think that democracy is taking, not our current form of government, is ever going to get us there, especially since we've become so terribly polarized. The only way out of it, I think, is to reimagine our government and redo our government. And how we get there is anybody's guess right now, because as Bob Reish pointed out, people do want democracy. I think they're wrong. Not our form of democracy.
Interesting.
But I did agree with him that we need to listen to other people's views. I keep, if I'm not hearing from other people, then it's in my head, it's the same old messages, and the same old produces the same old. So I do enjoy discussions with other people who also enjoyed discussions with other people. And, like I had a neighbor who we had wonderful discussions. We didn't change anybody's mind. That wasn't the point. The point was to hear each other out. And we did that. And it was actually fun. And it was especially fun when somebody else was listening in. We'd talk over his fence. And if somebody else came by and wanted to join the conversation, or, mostly they were just listening because we're going back and forth, and enjoyed each other. We were friends, and could do that. And they were kind of amazed, especially knowing that I'm pretty far to the left, and it was like they assumed that I would have a closed mind to a Trump supporter, and that wasn't the case. I also remember when we had it was a workshop at church that we were supposed to be developing our covenant of right relations. And there was like some readings or something. And then we were supposed to sit, we had picked a partner and we knew what the question was. And then they said, just sit quietly and think about this. And I remember Jim Bassler looking at me. We were partnered. Jim Bassler looked at me and said, I already know what that guy's got to say. I want to hear what you have to say.
Right. Yeah, Jane, go ahead.
I wanted to comment that I do agree with Jan that if we had a parliamentary form of government, I think that it would be more representative of a greater number of people. But I do also think that Robert Reish puts his finger on a key problem that is keeping any kind of representative government from working very well. and that is the fact that there is so much control by people, primarily corporations, that have so much money to influence the elections. And so part of it has got to be supporting the change in laws. And, you know, and I do believe that he believes so much that if democracy is realizing the state where we do what's good for the common good, instead of allowing a few influential forces to have so much control over the way government turns out, the way we legislate, what we do, how we support people or the lack thereof with services. And, you know, one of the things that I have read or become aware of just recently, which gives me cause for hope. I think, you know, I follow Robert Reish every day, pretty much, you know, in his blogs. I think that he still has optimism. In fact, in spite of the fact that the dynamics have never been more difficult. And I think he does have optimism that we still could turn things around. And I thought, you know, I see glimmers here and there all the time that he may be right. And one of them is the latest book from Robert Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone. He has now written a book called The Upswing, and he reports on the research that he is doing about how there is a groundswell of people across the country who are saying, let's do what's good for the common good instead of always thinking about what's good for just me. I haven't read the book yet. I'm eager to read it. I've seen good reports about it. So, you know, while we know that on lots of things like climate change, whatever we do may be too late, trying to turn around how we how people are represented by the government may not, you know, may be possible. We have seen it happen before. Things were horrible during the Gilded Age, and then we got good leadership, and there was a shift in people's attitudes after they saw so much suffering during the Depression, and everybody began to think, we need to be doing the things that are good for the common good. And so people work toward that for a long time, but we get careless and complacent, and we don't notice what's happening around us when things are going pretty good.
Exactly.
And we've had up until recently, a very broad middle class. A lot of that is either going up to the upper class or down to the lower class, much of it down to the lower class economically speaking. And this has happened without a lot of people not paying attention. So I just am, well, let me say, I thought that the presentation that he did was wonderful. And as his kidding aside, he also showed that, like Jan says, we have to listen to one another, and we have to do it in a respectful way, because the minute that we that we begin to express our ideas with sarcasm, with shaming and blaming, people stop listening. And so we don't know what they're thinking. They don't know what we're really thinking. And we never find common ground that way. So I just found this uplifting today, in spite of the fact that there's so much turmoil. And it makes me think of some of my sociology professors who always said, when there is about to be a major shift, people get very frightened about saving their positions, their privilege, whatever, you know, it is they're protecting. And they scream the loudest and they fight the hardest. But if the change happens, it moves ahead in spite of that, and things begin to normalize again. So I'm hoping that's what we're seeing. I know it is a truly frightening time in many ways.
Indeed. That's a perfect segue, but does anybody else want to say anything before I inject something? I don't see anything. Okay. Does anybody know how we got to thinking that the CEO of a corporation owes his allegiance to only the stockholders?
Oh,
Yeah, Paul.
yeah, of course, that happened when Milton Friedman came into the picture.
Bingo.
That's when it happened. And I go back earlier in my career, and I worked for some corporations. And sitting, I was not, but I was on the side listening to the people in power. and they were often talking about, hey, they recognized that they not only had to make profit for the company, but they had to realize that the customers and all the rest of them were part of their customers, And so, but I'll tell you, when that all changed, and I was in government at the time, and during the Reagan administration, and Milton Friedman made a very strong pitch for corporations to emphasize profit, and he said everything would be better. Well, that hasn't occurred.
No.
But that's the way he put it out there, and they took it and they ran with it.
And that is an economic theory that he promoted. And the big problem there, I mean, the reason that cascaded was that one or two CEOs took him at his word.
Yeah.
And they started making bigger profits by trashing the other stakeholders in the corporation just so that the stock price would go up.
Yeah.
And then as one CEO would look at that and see that his company wasn't doing as well, they just sort of cascaded. And so everybody bought in.
Everybody got online.
Yes.
They did. Yeah. And it happened pretty quick.
Indeed.
Up until that time, ever since the end of World War II, and that was not the case. But it, boom, it just took only about, 3-4 months or, maybe longer than that, but it wasn't long.
Right. But as Jane was saying, people are seeing this now. And when things get this serious, we can probably do something about it.
Yeah.
I'm very optimistic. In fact, I ran across a young guy the other day. He was an accountant, and I questioned him about things like PricewaterhouseCoopers and Enron, and how could that happen? We have a system in place. How could such a thing happen? And he was very, very straightforward, very knowledgeable about the fact that it wasn't PwC's fault per se. It was the fault of several employees who were supposed to be checking on each other, who got together and colluded so that they would profit. Well, now that these things are coming in the open, we can figure out a way to deal with it. And I see Dave's hand.
Yeah, I didn't want to shut you off, Charlie. I just wanted to get in the queue. I take Jan and Jane's point about alternative forms of representative government as as it being worthwhile talking about. The thing that frightens me is that the current Republican Party has absolutely no interest in leading as a majority party. What they are doing is they are creating the infrastructure that they need in order to be a ruling party without being a majority party. It's only going to take a few states, a very few states, and a very narrow election by the electorate for some of these voter nullification laws that are being passed around the country for a state legislature to legally overturn the results of elections. So that's the thing that frightens me. That's the thing that causes me to be, much more pessimistic than Jane is, or some of the others on the screen might be, because I think that it's getting very, very close, and we don't have a lot of time, and we still had 72 million people who voted for Donald Trump in our last election, despite the fact that they had 4 years of evidence in front of them as to what kind of a leader he was. So what does that say about the underlying DNA of metaphorically speaking, of course, of the people who are willing to either be full-throated backers of him, or satisfied and willing to live with the kind of country that he would turn the country into.
Anybody else here?
Well, that's not even a matter of too much money in politics. That's just the mindset of a lot of people, and how we deal with that, I don't know. When the Supreme Court said that corporations are people, and then they could pour all kinds of money into politics, that was pretty bad news, and we saw some of the results of it. But what happened in the last election was not because of money, because actually the Democrats raised more money than the Republicans. And yet, we darn near lost that election, as you said, Dave. It's a mindset. You can't drink my water, little girl. No.
It's all about you, Jan.
I know.
Let's get back to reality.
That little dog will have to start marching with a sign about his water rights.
She's a darling little thing, but I don't like black kitty fur in my water.
Oh, it was pretty. Well, I reading some of the good research that comes out of the Pew Center for Civic Engagement. It's both Democrats and Republicans who are deeply disenchanted with the way things are going. And Democrats didn't feel like the folks, when the Democrats did get in power, when Obama was there, a person we had high hopes for, who did some really good things, but didn't do nearly enough. They don't feel like the Democrats are helping them out much either, with their plight. So, I think it is a thing that everybody owns, and both parties own the problem, and it is going to take an enormous amount of civic engagement, I don't see it as much we have gotten, our two-party system, as Jan was saying, has gotten us into this thing about being the winner over the other party. And I don't see it as much about being about parties as it is about changing the mindset that it is not okay to leave a large group of your population behind
Right.
that doesn't have good health care and education and the things that we know make families succeed. So it's more about changing that kind of mindset. And I think that both Republicans and Democrats can rise to the occasion to work together on that. And it would be wonderful if we had a parliament, in my belief, a parliamentary form of government, because we need to go back. I mean, we do have a representative republic. We don't strictly have a democracy, but we say we operate on democratic principles. But democracy for our founding fathers meant that white male landowners could
Yes.
all vote. Now, look how far we've come.
Yes.
Women can vote, Black people can vote, brown people can vote, you know, I mean, but right now, the people who want to protect the status quo are seeing that suppressing the people with this bigger mindset to ask for what's good for the common good is the way to go to keep them from getting control and creating a very different, coming back to government for the common good. So, you know, it's about changing mindset, and like he said, his students, I think that's still true. Although I think Paul might argue with that, but at least, you know, some of the students and the even young students that I see and that I interact with, they have a really whole different attitude about this, about being more fair, more just in general. So I'm not going to give up. It may be hopeless, but I am afraid I'll live to 100, and it will probably be, because that's what my family does, and it'll probably be okay. But I'm just dying of curiosity to see, can we recover like we did after the recession and after the Gilded Age, when we saw the effects of leaving so many people out of the benefits of society.
Yeah, and let me add to what Jan was saying about civil discussion. I absolutely love civil discussion with people with different ideas. That's where I learn.
Mhm.
And I got to offer some hope for even old people. I used to be a real big fan of Milt Friedman, and I am now a big fan of Robert Reish. So, yeah, it is possible.
That is surprising, Charlie.
See, you can teach an old dog new tricks.
Yeah,
Right.
yes, indeed, Dave.
Change happens. Oh.
And I think that's about our time. I don't know who takes care of this, if Sarah's still there.
Yeah, she generally, isn't she there? She must be.
I'm still
Yeah,
here.
there she is.
It was a great session. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you all.
Charlie.
Yeah, it was very good. It was very good.
And what's up
I
next
just-
week?
The Farm Bureau for next week, and we're going to learn about what Farm Bureau is doing for our local farmers who are having a hard time, and find out what the prospects are for the future, possibly.
Yeah, I just want to interject. I have November for the roundtable, and if anyone has some idea, I have a couple of speakers in mind already. But if anybody wants to let me know about who they might want to have as a speaker, please let me know.
Yeah, I've got an idea, Paul. I'll
Good,
share
we'll
with
send
you.
it to me.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Charlie.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks, everyone.